Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to start on chapter 20, international trade. And I've got my little picture here of people trading goods and services for money. So I'm really excited. This is a great chapter. It's going to leverage a model we've already used a lot, the production possibilities frontier, to help us understand why countries trade, what it means to have a trade deficit versus a trade surplus, what trade means for the health and well-being of a country, and why economists generally agree that trade is good for everyone and should have the least amount of barriers possible. So, we're going to be looking at some new terminology, but hopefully a lot of this is actually fairly familiar. We're going to be, like I said, using that production possibilities frontier model. We're going to be talking about comparative advantage and absolute advantage, which means we're going to need that idea of opportunity cost again. We're going to be talking about different kinds of trade, gains from trade, intra-industry trade. And we're going to be talking about splitting up the supply chain, which should be kind of familiar. It's that idea of getting value added from each step in production, and that's how we see a lot of international trade happen now in the more modern era. We'll also talk about some barriers to trade like tariffs, and that's about it. So I'm really excited to get started, so grab your PowerPoint slides. This is chapter 20 in your OpenStax micro textbook, and let's get after it. All right, let's get started. So this chapter is divided up into 4 sections. The first 2 are kind of the big ideas, absolute advantage and comparative advantage, which are the source of the gains from trade and kind of showing how we expect trade to truly be beneficial to economies. And then talking about the difference between them and why even with a lot of advantage in a given country, there's still benefits to trade. And then the last 2 sections talking about intra-industry trade and similar economies and the benefits of reducing barriers to trade, kind of wraps all these ideas up and touches on a few fine points. And the big idea here that we want to think about is where our goods and services actually come from. And we're going to talk a lot about goods in this chapter, but we want to remember that increasingly developed economies like the United States and other economies are going to be leaning on a lot of services, exporting and importing services being a big part of trade. But it's a lot easier to conceptualize this stuff with goods. And so think about cell phones. Think about your cell phone, an iPhone or a Samsung phone, and think about who makes that phone. Do you consider it to be a US produced good, or do you consider it to be a Korean good? The iPhone is generally considered to be an Apple product. That's a US company. But the reality is it has components that are produced in a lot of other countries. And so when we're dealing with complicated or even complex goods, it's not always 100% clear where it came from because components can be produced in different countries. And that's really what we're going to be talking about. International trade, there can be conflicts between countries focusing on what they do best and who should produce what. And so that's kind of what we want to deconstruct a little bit here. So the first thing we want to talk about is this idea that the benefits of trade come from countries producing to their advantage. And we have 2 kinds of advantage. The first one is pretty straightforward. It's absolute advantage. And it's the idea that you can produce a good with fewer inputs, fewer resources. So less money, fewer hours of labor, less input materials. And it's going to make a country more productive or able to produce more relative to another country. But it's not the only measure of an advantage. Absolute advantage is obvious and clear. It's lower cost, basically. But comparative advantage is going to arise from different opportunity costs. And this is the idea that I might not be able to produce it in fewer labor hours than you, but compared to what else I could be producing, this is my most efficient choice. And so it's going to be talking about production in terms of other goods. So if I'm producing sandwiches, how many cups of coffee do I give up? If I'm producing cell phones, how many computers could I have produced with those same inputs, with that same labor? And this is going to make so much more sense with an example. I have some examples that I can show you in other videos, but we'll go through the example in the textbook here, looking at the US and Saudi Arabia producing corn and oil. So here we have the two countries. We have Saudi Arabia and the United States. And they both have, we're going to assume they both have 100 hours of labor. And with that, they can produce either corn or oil. And what we're going to see is that they have different production functions, different abilities to produce those goods. And that's basically going to arise from the reality that they have different endowments. And endowments is just the fancy econ term for what the countries have built in. So we know that even though the US and Saudi Arabia both have 100 hours of labor, in that time, the US could produce a maximum of 50 barrels of oil or 100 bushels of corn. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, could either produce 100 barrels of oil or 25 bushels of corn. And that makes sense to a certain extent, right? Saudi Arabia is going to be better at producing oil because they have more underground. And they're not going to be great at producing oil or at producing corn. They don't have a lot of arable land and the climate's not really acclimated to it. Whereas in the United States, we're going to expect the United States to produce corn pretty efficiently. The United States could produce either 50 barrels of oil, because we do have some oil in the United States, or 100 bushels of corn. And I like to think of this another way. Another way we could think of this is that the cost of producing oil in Saudi Arabia is 1 hour of labor, and that the cost of producing corn in Saudi Arabia is 4 hours of labor. The 100 hours they have could be used to produce 25 bushels of corn. That means it takes 4 hours to produce each of those 25 bushels. For the United States, on the other hand, it takes 1 hour to produce a bushel of corn and 2 hours to produce oil. And these are our explicit costs, right? These are the costs that are going to help us determine comparative and absolute advantage. So we have two production possibilities frontiers here for each country. We have Saudi Arabia can produce either corn or oil. And if they produce only oil, they can produce 100 units. If they produce only corn, they can produce 25 bushels. And we'll graph their PPF. And then we have the US, and they can also produce corn or oil. If they focus all of their energy on corn, they can produce 100 bushels. If they focus all of their energy on oil, they can produce 50 bushels. And now we have two PPFs that allow us to compare the two countries, just like in your slides, just like in your book. And there's multiple points they could choose to produce at along those PPFs. They could produce all oil here, or all corn here, or a mix, 60 barrels of oil and only 10 bushels of corn here. So let me fill those numbers in for us so we have it all cleared away. And the US could do the same. They could produce all oil here, all corn down here, or they could produce about 50-50, an even mix. They could produce, 20 barrels of oil, and they could have enough labor left to produce 60 bushels of corn. 20 barrels of oil will cost them 40 hours, leaving them with 60 hours less to produce 1 hour each corn. So this gives us a sense of the productivity of each country. Now that we have a sense of their individual productivity, we can think about how they might be able to engage in trade and be made better off. And in order to engage in trade, we want them to focus on what they're best at. And if we're looking at absolute advantage, we want to look at who has the lowest cost, who can produce the most relative to the other. Saudi Arabia can produce oil in 1 hour. The U.S. can produce it in 2 hours. Given 100 hours, the U.S. can produce 50 barrels. Saudi can produce 100 barrels. So Saudi Arabia has the absolute advantage in producing oil relative to the U.S. But when it comes to corn, with 100 hours, the U.S. can produce 100 bushels. Saudi can only produce 25. Corn costs an hour in the U.S., but it costs 4 hours in Saudi. So the U.S. has the absolute advantage in producing corn. So right here with our C points, we have Saudi focusing on mostly producing oil and the U.S. focusing on mostly producing corn. Those are great points to represent producing to your advantage, producing to your absolute advantage. And so what we'll see is we can also calculate the comparative advantage. And that's going to come from a couple of different ways. We can conceptualize comparative advantage very easily by looking at the PPF and looking at the opportunity cost. We can find the opportunity cost by just deriving the slope of the production possibilities frontier, the PPF. We can also compare the costs here. If I want to find the opportunity cost of producing oil for Saudi Arabia, it's going to come from how much corn is given up every time they produce oil. Well, if it takes an hour to produce oil, how much corn could Saudi Arabia have produced in that 1 hour? Could they produce a whole bushel of corn? No. A whole bushel of corn takes 4 hours. What they could have produced is 1/4 of a bushel of corn. On the other hand, at times it takes them to produce corn in those 4 hours, how much oil could they have produced? Every time Saudi Arabia decides to produce corn and spends 4 hours producing corn, they're giving up 4 barrels of oil. So the opportunity cost of corn is 4 barrels of oil. And we can do the same thing over here with the United States. We have our opportunity cost here. And we want to see, okay, in the 2 hours it takes them to produce oil, how much corn do they give up? Well, producing oil takes 2 hours, producing corn takes 1 hour. So every time they produce oil, they could have produced 2 bushels of corn. Or every time they produce corn, they give up the opportunity. They have the opportunity cost of 1/2 a barrel of oil. Does that kind of make sense? Now, looking at the opportunity costs, we can also find comparative advantage. And comparative advantage comes from the lowest opportunity cost. So in the case of making oil, every time the U.S. makes oil, they give up 2 bushels of corn, and Saudi gives up 1/4 of a bushel of corn. So which is smaller, 2 or 1/4? 1/4 is way smaller. That's a comparative advantage, right? They have the comparative advantage of the lower opportunity cost when it comes to producing oil. What about corn? When the U.S. produces corn, it costs them 1/2 a barrel of oil. But what's the opportunity cost in Saudi Arabia? In Saudi Arabia, producing 1 bushel of corn costs them, they give up the opportunity to produce 4 barrels of oil. So the U.S. is going to have the comparative advantage in producing corn also. So in this case, the countries have the same comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Is that always the case? Absolutely not. But it's kind of nice when it is. And that comparative advantage and that absolute advantage give us the gains from trade. So how would these countries trade? If we think about them producing to their comparative advantage and producing more corn in the U.S. and more oil in Saudi Arabia, we can imagine a situation where they could trade and get more of everything. And that's coming from these advantages. So hopefully the idea of comparative advantage and opportunity cost makes sense. So now we want to assume trade. And what we're going to go ahead and assume is that we have Saudi Arabia producing corn and oil. Oh, this is going to get messy. Here, let's do it this way. I know my screen is a little bit small when the slides are up, but I still think it's useful to kind of walk through the example. So we have the amount of oil produced and the amount of corn produced. And we're going to compare Saudi Arabia and the United States. If the United States and Saudi Arabia produce to their comparative advantages, we are going to see Saudi Arabia produce 60 barrels of oil and 10 bushels of corn, while the United States is going to produce 20 barrels of oil and 60 bushels of corn. So our total or world production is going to be, we have 80 barrels of oil and 70 bushels of corn. Now we want them to engage in trade. And you can already see the slide here showing consumption beyond the PPF. So in this case, we're going to assume that they're going to engage in trade, and the 20 units of oil are going to be exported by Saudi Arabia and exchanged for 20 units of corn by the United States. So let's look at that, and we'll look at Saudi Arabia first, and then we'll look at the United States. So how am I going to do this? Let's put it this way. Okay. So that's 10, that's 60, that's 70, and then trade. And then we'll have the totals up here. So if they're going to engage in trade, we're going to see Saudi Arabia export 20 oil and import 20 corn, while the U.S. is going to import the 20 oil and export the 20 corn. And so the totals are going to be, in terms of oil and corn, that now Saudi Arabia is going to have 60 minus 20, or 40 barrels of oil, and 10 plus 20, 30 bushels of corn. On the other hand, here in the United States, we're going to have 20 barrels of oil we produced plus 20 we imported for 40, and 60 barrels of 60 bushels of corn minus the 20 we exported, or another 40 bushels of corn. And so now we have consumption points. The Saudi Arabia is getting 40 oil and 30 corn, and U.S. is getting 40 and 40. So let's graph those points and see what we get. For Saudi to have 40 barrels of oil, it's going to be about here, and 30 bushels of corn, that's going to be about here. That's beyond their PPF. That is an impossible production point, but with trade, it's possible. What about the U.S.? They're going to be at 40 and 40, again, beyond their PPF, but possible with trade. And that's one example of how trade can make everyone better off. Both countries are able to consume beyond their production possibilities frontier, beyond what they would have been able to produce on their own, thanks to that exchange. And that's why economists love trade. The gains from trade is what a country can consume when a country can consume more than it produces as a result of specialization and exchange. So, What happens if a country has the absolute advantage in everything? And this can happen if we imagine comparing, in trade, we usually look at two countries at a time. So we can imagine comparing a high-tech country with lots of resources and a really refined labor force to a less developed country or a lower income country with fewer natural resources. There's still benefit because of the comparative advantage. There's always going to be a comparative advantage differential that we can focus on to allow countries to specialize a little bit, because no one's that good at everything. And to demonstrate that, we have a fun example here. Here we have the example of refrigerators and shoes comparing the United States and Mexico. We can see here that the United States has 40 workers and they can produce either 10,000 shoes and 0 refrigerators or 40,000 refrigerators and 0 shoes. So basically each worker can either produce 1,000 refrigerators or the 40 workers can produce 10,000 shoes. The same number of workers can produce much, much smaller numbers in Mexico. And I guess we're assuming that's because they don't have as much technology or less skilled workforce. But their maximum productivity of shoes is only 8,000, and their maximum productivity of refrigerators is only 10,000. But we can see that if they do have a difference in comparative advantage. And by calculating the opportunity costs, we can derive that comparative advantage, okay? So in this case, finding the opportunity cost to derive the comparative advantage is a little bit harder, but you can see, first of all, the US can produce more shoes with fewer workers, more refrigerators with fewer workers, Mexico not so much. But if we look at how many refrigerators the US gives up every time they produce shoes, producing 1,000 shoes, it's going to cost them 4,000 refrigerators. So their opportunity cost when they produce shoes, they're giving up a lot of refrigerators. On the other hand, if we look at the relationship between shoes and refrigerators for Mexico, when they produce shoes, they're actually giving up a small amount of refrigerators, only about 1.25 refrigerators. And so what we see is they actually have a lower opportunity cost associated with producing shoes. And we can determine the terms of trade from the opportunity cost. And you can see that in the textbook too. When they produce to their comparative advantage and then exchange for less than their opportunity cost, they can both be made better off. And that's how you achieve those points B on the graph, where you see both countries consuming beyond their production possibilities frontier, even though in this example, one country is a better producer of both goods, has a lower absolute advantage, another country has a lower comparative advantage in something else. And so even when a country has an absolute advantage in both goods, there's still a benefit from trade, because trade is going to allow them to take advantage of that lower opportunity cost. And so the idea here is that the gains from trade come from pursuing that comparative advantage and producing to the lower opportunity cost. And if that kind of doesn't make sense, this is a really great metaphor for it. The book calls it Comparative Advantage Goes Camping. So imagine, I don't know if you are a camper or not, but imagine that a bunch of friends are going to go camping. There's always that one person who's the expert. They have all the stuff and they've been camping the most. And so technically they are the best at everything. Does that mean that person should do everything, even if they're more experienced at every aspect of camping? No, of course not. You're not all going to sit around and watch one friend do all the work. And so you're going to find out what you're a little bit better at, and they're going to produce what they're the best at. And that's the idea of comparative advantage, finding the best way to contribute based on the idea that explicit cost is not the only cost. Opportunity cost is also a big deal. And so there's still always going to be benefit from exchange and from specialization. And that's the big takeaway here. So now we want to get to these other finer points. The first one is this idea of intra-industry trade between similar economies. And so this is the idea of why do countries like Australia and Europe in the United States engage in so much trade? Or why do we see cell phones being produced in 2 different countries with components from different countries? The theory of comparative advantage makes us think that trade should just happen between economies with big differences in opportunity cost. But when we look at the numbers, we see that maybe half of the world's trade involves shipping goods between pretty similar countries. And part of that's just because countries like to trade with similar countries. There's a lot of diplomacy that takes place in trade, but there's something else there too. What we tend to see is a lot of intra-industry or between industry trade, trade between countries in the same industry. And that comes from 2 big ideas. The first is that division of labor can lead to learning, innovation, and unique skill sets. And the second is this idea of economies of scale. And economies of scale, remember, is just this idea that we can scale something up and increase the productivity and decrease the cost. So these 2 ideas come from this idea that we can get more specialization by breaking something down. And so by working on very small, specific parts of producing a larger, complicated good, companies and countries can specialize to an even higher degree. So rather than just specializing in refrigerators, a country could specialize in the condenser for refrigerators. This idea is considered, it's called splitting up the value chain. And it means that we're going to split up the stages of production of one good into lots of different stages. So the value chain is this process of the most basic ingredients to the final product. Each level of production is adding value. When we split up the value chain, we can let different companies in different countries specialize on the tiniest part of productivity and then trade it. And that's going to allow them to get really good at just that one part and scale it up. And that's going to be really beneficial. And that's why we see so much intra-industry trade. The economies of scale idea is just that, hey, producing a car is complicated and has a lot of parts. And yes, the more cars we produce, the more we can lower the price. But you know what you could also do? Have one company produce just engines, and one company just produce carburetors, or just produce doors, or just produce windows. And then we all ship these parts that are specialized and produced at a large scale at lots of different companies in lots of different countries, and have them all assembled in a final place. And that's this idea of economies of scale and competition and splitting up the value chain. So here's an example of economies of scale. And this is looking at the example of producing toasters. And the idea here is that the bigger the plant, the more they're producing, the lower the cost. And so as we see, as we move from plant S to plant M, the cost per unit of producing gets lower and lower, all the way until we get to plant L. And that's when economies of scale are maximized or achieved. And then after that point, there's no benefit to getting bigger. At plant V, even though it's bigger, it's not cheaper. And so this is the idea that there is some limit to economies of scale. There can be the alternative, right? There can be economies, diseconomies of scale, where it's easier to produce something one-to-one, and as you scale up, you can have coordination issues. But we're going to tend to see a lot of productivity take place with economies of scale. And one of the really important things about productivity and about microeconomics, if you haven't taken your econ principles of microeconomics yet, is figuring out where that efficient scale is. And it's going to be a function of the production function associated with that good. So what are the benefits then to reducing barriers to trade? Well, to talk about that first, we need to know what the barriers to trade are. And there's lots of different kinds of barriers to trade. The main one we want to think about here, and we're going to talk about here, is tariffs. And a tariff is just a tax on imports. So it's just a way for governments to say, okay, yes, you can sell your stuff here, but we are going to take a cut. And it does two things. It raises revenue for the local government, and it raises the price of the imported goods. So if there's a tariff on Samsung phones compared to Apple phones because Samsungs are imported, that's going to make them more expensive relative to an iPhone. And that's going to protect iPhones a little bit from too much competition. So tariffs can be used to generate revenue. They can be used to limit imports. They can also be used as a political tool in terms of the geopolitical goals of a country. So if I want to punish another country, if I'm really, really mad at France, I can put taxes on their cheeses, and that's going to punish them and hurt their exporters because it's going to raise the cost of U.S. consumers buying their goods. The other kind of barrier to trade that we don't really talk about in the book, but you can also think about, is a quota. And a quota is just, instead of using price as the mechanism, it's using quantity. And it's just saying, listen, yes, you can import your Saudi Arabian oil, but we will only accept 20 barrels, not a barrel more. So it's another way of limiting imports, protecting domestic firms and that kind of thing. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO, is committed to lowering barriers to trade. They are an organization that is designed to let other countries meet with each other and negotiate in a sort of non-confrontational way to try and reduce barriers to trade, specifically reducing tariffs, quotas, and other things. And the idea is to try and get all countries to reduce their barriers to trade, because there is a little bit of tit for tat. I'm not going to reduce your tariffs until you reduce, I'm not going to reduce my tariffs until you reduce your tariffs. And so the WTO tries to really facilitate that and make it easier, with the goal of just making things more affordable for consumers and getting the best quality, lowest cost goods out there. And there are big benefits to that. Low-income countries benefit from trade. High-income countries benefit too. And the gains from trade come from a lot of different places. It comes from access to a greater variety of goods. It comes from lower cost from the best producers producing it. It comes from splitting up that value chain and economies of scale. And we also want to remember that even a small gain is enough to deserve some attention, because it's not a one-time increase. It's going to be a persistent increase over time. And these gains, these benefits from trade, are going to add up over time. Estimates of gains from trade may be low, but that's just because the gains are not necessarily measured well in economics, because it's really difficult to measure all of the benefits from trade. The benefits of consumers getting access to a wide variety of goods, seeing more competition between producers on the global scale, those can be hard to actually measure. Saying, oh, well, it's a lower cost, that's one way to do it, but it can be really difficult to measure that. And trade between countries has other benefits too for firms. It's going to mean more exchange of ideas, sharing in knowledge, skills, technology, and that's going to benefit lots of industries and help perpetuate economic growth through the birth of ideas and the exchange of ideas. And that's a really, really good thing that was really difficult to measure. And so in general, economists are always going to favor free or at least low barrier trade. So that's it. That's chapter 20. Hopefully you enjoyed it and it helped you understand why economists are so pro-trade, why there are so many political actors and economic advisors trying to reduce barriers to trade, why trade has generally been considered really beneficial to society, and if sometimes these macroeconomic concepts can be a little too esoteric and complex for you, you can always think about it on the individual level. Imagine if we produced all the stuff we consumed on our own, how costly that would be relative to the kinds of exchange we engage in when we specialize in one thing or two things or three things, and then we trade for everything else using the money we earn. We all have a specialty, right? We all have comparative advantages that we can produce to as individuals, as states, as countries. And when we produce to our comparative advantages, we can all be made better off. Let me know what questions you have, and I will see you next time. Take care.